It was January 29th, 1945, at 2:47 p.m. in Holtzheim, Belgium. As First Sergeant Leonard Funk came around a farmhouse, he froze in his tracks. 90 German soldiers were looking right at him. About half were already armed, while the others were grabbing for rifles piled nearby. 4 American GIs were on their knees in the snow, hands behind their heads. Just 20 minutes earlier, these same Germans had been prisoners of war. 80 of them had been taken by Funk's own company while clearing the village, left under the watch of just 4 men, the only ones available. But now, they had turned the tables, armed themselves, and were preparing a rear assault on Company C. An officer emerged from the group, jammed the barrel of an MP-40 into Funk's gut, and bellowed at him in German. The problem was, Funk didn't understand a word of German, and neither did any of the captured Americans. The German officer just yelled again, his voice rising and his face flushing crimson. Funk took in the scene, the 90 enemy soldiers, his 4 captured men, the submachine gun digging into his stomach. And he began to laugh. The officer's expression shifted from pure confusion to unbridled fury as he shouted even louder. But Funk only laughed harder. The entire incident that followed was over in less than 60 seconds. In that time, 21 Germans would be killed, and the rest would drop their guns and surrender. This incredible moment of battlefield audacity would earn Leonard Funk the Medal of Honor. And it all started with a laugh he couldn't contain. His full name was Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr. He came into the world on August 27th, 1916, in Braddock Township, Pennsylvania. It was a classic steel town, defined by the smokestacks and foundries along the Monongahela River, just 8 miles east of Pittsburgh. Life forced Funk to mature quickly and take on responsibility from a young age. When he finished high school in 1934, he had already spent years looking after his younger brother. America was in the 5th grueling year of the Great Depression. Work was hard to find, and higher education was an impossible dream for most. Then, in June of 1941, as conflict consumed Europe and Asia, Congress expanded the draft. Funk's number was called. He made his way to the induction center in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, a 24-year-old man standing 5 feet, 5 inches tall, and weighing 140 pounds. The Army examiner likely sized him up and pegged him for a desk job. That assessment couldn't have been more wrong. Funk put his name down for the paratroopers. Back in 1941, the idea of an American airborne force was still in its infancy. It was a radical new concept, leaping from a perfectly functional plane to fight completely surrounded, deep in enemy territory. To the average soldier, it sounded like a death wish. But the men who volunteered were cut from a different cloth. They had to be. The training regimen for the airborne was engineered to shatter a man's limits. It was 5 weeks of non-stop running, jumping, climbing, and falling a brutal physical gauntlet that eliminated half of all who tried. After that came the jump towers, and finally, the planes. That initial leap from a C-47 at 1,200 feet goes against every survival instinct. Every fiber of your being screams to clutch the doorframe for dear life. The earth seems impossibly far below. The wind rips past your face. Your survival depends on nothing more than some fabric, a few cords, and a whole lot of faith. Funk made it through and earned his jump wings. He was posted to Company C, 1st Battalion of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment at Camp Blanding, Florida. By late 1943, The 508th was shipping out to England to join the legendary 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans, already combat-hardened from the campaigns in Sicily and Italy. These were soldiers who had already parachuted under fire, who had taken lives and seen their comrades fall. Funk was the newcomer. At 27, he was practically an old man by paratrooper standards, with most of the men in his squad barely out of their teens. But Funk possessed what they lacked: a mature, steady presence and a quiet confidence that inspired men to follow him through anything. When D-Day arrived, he was leading a squad. Before the war was over, he'd be the acting executive officer for his company. But first, he had to make it through Normandy. It's June 6th, 1944, 1:30 in the morning. The C-47 Skytrain lurches violently as anti-aircraft shells burst around it. Funk stands in the stick, the single file of paratroopers ready to leap, with 60 pounds of gear cinched tight to his frame. He carried an M1A1 Thompson submachine gun, along with ammunition, grenades, rations, and a medkit. The plane was flying at a mere 400 feet, far too low for a safe deployment. The pilots had no choice. They couldn't gain altitude with the sky thick with German flak. Red tracers crisscrossed the night sky like swarms of angry insects, and the troopers could hear shrapnel striking the plane's metal skin. 13,000 paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were part of the Normandy invasion. Their mission was to drop in behind the landing beaches, seize vital bridges and road junctions, and block German reinforcements from getting to the coastline. But almost nothing went as planned. The green light flashed. Funk leaped into the night. He was slammed by the prop blast, a force like a physical blow. Then his parachute snapped open, and an eerie silence fell. Beneath him lay France-occupied France. He was completely surrounded by the enemy. From its very first moments, the D-Day airborne drop was pure chaos. The intense German flak had broken up the troop carrier formations, scattering them over a 50-mile stretch of the French landscape. Some paratroopers landed in intentionally flooded fields, drowning under their heavy gear. Others descended directly into German positions, killed before they even had a chance to unbuckle their parachutes. Funk hit the ground with brutal force. His ankle buckled on impact. It was a severe sprain, possibly even a fracture. The pain was sharp and blinding, and he knew every step for the next couple of weeks would be torture. But he could still walk, and more importantly, he could still fight. He collected and buried his parachute, then began to move out. He was 40 miles away from his intended drop zone. 40 miles of enemy-controlled land lay ahead of him, and he was alone in the dark. But within a few hours, he began to gather other lost paratroopers' men from various units, companies, and regiments. The group eventually grew to 18 soldiers, all of them searching for someone to lead. Funk stepped up. For the next 10 days, he guided this makeshift unit deep inside German lines, moving only under the cover of darkness, concealing themselves during the day, and engaging the enemy only when absolutely necessary. Despite the searing pain from his ankle, he insisted on taking the point position as lead scout, deliberately placing himself in the greatest danger to safeguard his men. On June 17th, they finally made contact with friendly Allied forces. Every man in his group had made it. Not a single one was lost. After 10 days operating behind enemy lines and crossing 40 miles of occupied France, Leonard Funk brought them all back safely. For his actions, he received the Silver Star, the nation's third highest award for valor, a Bronze Star for meritorious service, and his first Purple Heart. But Funk's story was far from over. September 17th, 1944, brought him to Holland for Operation Market Garden. This was to be the most massive airborne operation ever attempted, with 35,000 paratroopers descending on the Netherlands to seize a chain of bridges over the Rhine River. British, American, and Polish units were all participating in the jump. Success meant the Allies could potentially push into Germany and end the war by Christmas. Field Marshal Montgomery's strategy was bold, perhaps too bold. The airborne troops were tasked with taking and holding 7 bridges spanning 64 miles of Dutch landscape, while armored ground columns would speed up a single road to relieve them. The entire operation hinged on speed, surprise, and flawless execution, but nearly everything that could go wrong did. At the farthest bridge in Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division was dropped right on top of 2 SS Panzer divisions that intelligence had missed. They were immediately surrounded. For 9 brutal days, they fought a desperate battle in the city streets. Out of 10,000 men, only 2,000 escaped. The battle for a bridge too far would become a textbook example of military overreach. Leonard Funk, however, was unaware of the strategic disaster unfolding. He was focused solely on his orders: support the landings, secure the drop zones, and eliminate any German resistance. After landing, his company took its objective without major incident. It was textbook procedure. The 508th was operating near Nijmegen, tasked with helping to secure the bridges needed for the ground offensive to push forward. But then Funk spotted something that wasn't in the mission briefing. 3 German 20mm anti-aircraft guns were chewing up the sky, targeting the approaching Allied gliders. Those gliders were filled with critical reinforcements jeeps, artillery, ammo, and medical supplies. If those guns weren't silenced, hundreds of Allied soldiers would be slaughtered before their boots even touched the ground. The enemy emplacement was heavily fortified on high ground near Weiler. It was manned by about 20 German soldiers who provided security for the gun crews, all protected by sandbags, camouflage, and overlapping fields of fire. Funk had just 3 men with him. Military doctrine called for a 3-to-1 superiority for attacking a fortified position. Funk was facing the reverse. He was outnumbered almost 7-to-1. He charged forward regardless. With Funk leading the way, his tiny 3-man patrol launched a direct assault on the German strongpoint. They eliminated the security element, rushed the gun pits, and took out all 3 cannons and their crews. 20 Germans against 4 Americans. The guns fell silent. The gliders touched down without further incident. For this, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the 2nd highest medal for valor, just shy of the Medal of Honor itself. Funk now held a Silver Star and a Distinguished Service Cross, 2 of the most prestigious combat awards in the U.S. military. Most men who receive even one are hailed as lifelong heroes. But Funk's war wasn't over. On December 16, 1944, Germany unleashed its final, desperate gamble. 3 entire armies, 400,000 men, 1,400 tanks, and 1,900 artillery pieces smashed into the American lines in the Ardennes forest, driving for the critical port of Antwerp. It was a wildly ambitious plan from Hitler, yet it came dangerously close to succeeding. He was betting everything on this one colossal offensive, hoping to split the Allied forces, seize Antwerp, and compel the Western Allies into a negotiated truce. This would free up Germany to concentrate its full might against the Soviets on the Eastern Front. For the American forces, It was an absolute catastrophe. The attack struck at the weakest points in the line, sectors held by inexperienced new troops or battle-weary veterans who had been sent there for a rest. Whole divisions simply collapsed. Thousands of GIs were forced to surrender. The German onslaught punched a 50-mile-deep salient into the Allied front, creating what would forever be known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was the single largest and bloodiest battle fought by the U.S. Army in the entire war, resulting in 89,000 American casualties. On top of that, the weather was horrific, with snow, ice, and temperatures plunging to 5 degrees below zero. Soldiers were freezing to death in their fighting positions. Rifles and machine guns jammed solid. Engines on trucks and tanks refused to turn over. The bitter cold became an enemy just as lethal as the Germans. And then came the atrocity at Malmedy. On December 17th, 1944, just one day after the offensive began, a convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was ambushed near the Bonnier Crossroads by the lead elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper, a notorious SS Panzer unit. The American soldiers were support staff artillery spotters and radio men, not frontline grunts. They were completely unprepared for a clash with tanks and armored infantry. After a short, brutal fight, 113 Americans laid down their arms. They were marched into a snow-covered field near a crossroads, hands in the air, disarmed, now prisoners of war. And then the SS raised their rifles and opened fire. The Germans mowed them down. Men who broke and ran were cut to pieces. Those who fell wounded were dispatched with a single pistol shot to the head. 84 Americans perished in that field. A few managed to survive by feigning death, lying motionless in the freezing snow for hours, listening to the crunch of German boots and the sound of casual laughter. As darkness fell, 43 survivors crawled to safety, eventually reaching American lines. News of the massacre spread like wildfire through the American ranks. The word was out. The Germans were executing prisoners. Malmedy changed the very nature of the war. Before, there had been an unspoken code, a set of unwritten rules. You surrendered when the fight was lost. You treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. A grim sort of professional respect existed between adversaries. After Malmedy, that code was shattered. American GIs swore they would never be taken alive by the SS. Some units even issued standing orders, take no SS prisoners. When Funk heard what had happened, something inside him turned to steel. He'd already endured the horrors of Normandy and Holland, watching friends die across the fields of Europe. But this was different. This wasn't war. This was murder. It was the cold-blooded execution of men who had surrendered honorably. In that moment, Leonard Funk made a vow he would never, under any circumstances, surrender to the Germans. That solemn promise would be put to the test far sooner than he could have imagined. January 29th, 1945, the Ardennes, the great German offensive had been shattered, and now the Allies were on the counterattack. Company C of the 508th Parachute Infantry received its orders, seize the Belgian village of Holzheim. There was just one problem. Company C was critically undermanned. Its executive officer, the second in command, had been killed in action, and they simply lacked the manpower for a full-scale assault. Funk. Now the acting executive officer scanned his depleted company roster and came to a stark conclusion. He strode over to the headquarters tent, where he found the clerks, the supply sergeants, the cook's men who kept the company running but rarely saw the sharp end of a rifle. "You're all infantrymen now," Funk announced. "Grab your weapons. We're taking that village." With that, he cobbled together a makeshift platoon of 30 men who had spent most of the war behind a typewriter, not a machine gun. They'd all had basic training, of course. But for most of them, firing a weapon at another human being was something they'd never done. Funk didn't have a choice. He needed riflemen, and he would forge them in the crucible of combat. The journey to Holzheim was a grueling 15-mile trek through a blinding blizzard with snowdrifts that were sometimes waist-deep. The temperature was well below freezing, and German artillery shells periodically rained down around them, a constant, harassing fire. Funk led his men from the very front. Upon reaching the village, he quickly organized the attack. His collection of clerks and makeshift warriors charged in behind him, 15 houses, and every single one was a German stronghold. Through a hail of machine gun fire, rifles, and grenades, Funk and his improbable platoon cleared them all. They captured 30 prisoners without suffering a single American casualty. On the far side of town, another unit rounded up 50 more Germans. That brought the total to 80 prisoners, who were herded into the yard of a large farmhouse. Funk looked over his exhausted men. They had been on the move and in combat for hours on end, and pockets of German resistance still lingered in other parts of the village. He knew he could only spare 4 men to stand guard over the captured soldiers. "Hold them here," he ordered the small detail. "We'll get reinforcements to you as soon as we can." With that, Funk turned and plunged back into the fight. He had no inkling of the disaster that was about to unfold behind him. As Funk's men were mopping up the last of the resistance in Holzheim, a German patrol materialized out of the swirling snow, heading for the farmhouse. There were 10, perhaps 20 men, all wearing white camouflage capes over their winter uniforms. In the blizzard and confusion, they were nearly indistinguishable from American troops. By the time the 4 guards recognized the threat, it was already over. The Germans overwhelmed the guards in an instant, disarming them and forcing them to their knees. They immediately liberated the 80 prisoners. In a flash, the situation had reversed. There were now at least 90 German soldiers in the farmhouse yard. They scrambled to retrieve their discarded weapons from a pile and quickly began to organize. They had one clear objective: to slam into the rear of Company C. Funk's company was spread thin throughout the village, hunting down the last holdouts, completely oblivious to the threat forming behind them. If 90 Germans hit them now, from an unexpected direction, it would be an absolute slaughter. The German officer in command, likely a lieutenant or a captain, began snapping out orders, positioning machine guns and setting the perfect ambush. All they had to do was wait for his signal. It was at that exact moment that Leonard Funk rounded the corner of the building. He was just doing a routine check, making sure the prisoners were secure and his guards were holding up. He was not remotely prepared to walk into a courtyard filled with 90 armed and hostile Germans. He came around the farmhouse and froze. The scene was utterly surreal. His 4 guards were kneeling helplessly in the snow. The prisoners, who should have been disarmed and under control, were now standing everywhere, holding rifles and preparing for battle. The German officer's eyes locked onto Funk instantly. The first sergeant's stripes on his sleeve identified him as a leader, a valuable capture. The officer strode forward, shoved the muzzle of his MP-40 submachine gun into Funk's stomach, and screamed a command in German surrender. "Drop your weapon." But Funk didn't understand a word of German. He stared blankly as the officer shouted again, his voice even louder, his face turning crimson with rage. Funk glanced around. 90 Germans, most of them armed. His own 4 men, disarmed and on their knees. Another American soldier stood beside him, equally powerless. The odds of survival were non-existent. There was no tactical scenario in which Leonard Funk could win this engagement. He was outnumbered 90-1. The only rational, sensible course of action was to surrender. But Funk wasn't thinking rationally. He was thinking about malmedy. He saw 84 Americans butchered in a field, shot down like animals. He had already made up his mind he would die before he surrendered to the Germans. So, instead of raising his hands, Leonard Funk did something utterly baffling. He started to laugh. No one will ever know for sure why he did it. Perhaps it was a calculated gamble, a way to sow confusion and buy himself a precious second. Perhaps it was the sheer stress of the moment. The mind can crack in strange ways when facing imminent death. Or maybe it was genuine. Dark amusement at the pure absurdity of it all. A furious officer was screaming at him in a language he didn't comprehend, demanding his surrender. Funk himself later admitted he tried to stop laughing, but simply couldn't. Something about the Germans' frantic screaming just struck him as funny. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic for the German plan. The officer yelled louder, and Funk only laughed harder, bending over with the force of it as he called out to his men. "I don't understand what he's saying!" He gasped. Some of the German soldiers, seeing the bizarre spectacle, began to chuckle themselves. The tension was thick and strange. Their officer was practically purple with rage, and this captured American was cackling uncontrollably. The German was completely disoriented. This wasn't standard procedure. Prisoners were supposed to beg, to plead, to surrender. They weren't supposed to laugh in your face as you held a gun to their stomach. For a few crucial, heart-stopping seconds, the German officer was paralyzed by indecision. And Leonard Funk seized those seconds, still putting on a show of laughter. Funk, slowly, deliberately, began to raise his hand toward the Thompson submachine gun slung over his shoulder, the standard way paratroopers carried their weapon. The German officer watched, thinking this was it. The American was finally giving up his weapon. Funk's fingers wrapped around the pistol grip of the Thompson. He began to ease it from his shoulder, his movements slow and non-threatening. The German officer relaxed his posture by the slightest fraction. He was about to secure another prisoner, and then, in one explosive, lightning-fast motion, Funk swung the Thompson down, leveled the muzzle, and squeezed the trigger. The M1A1 Thompson spits out 45 ACP rounds at a rate of 600 per minute. At point-blank range, each bullet hits with the force of a sledgehammer. They don't just wound, they obliterate. The initial burst tore into the German officer's chest. 30 rounds in under 3 seconds. The officer was dead before he even hit the snow. But Funk didn't stop. He couldn't. The instant he opened fire, he had made a pact with himself, kill every one of them or die trying. There was no in-between. He pivoted, the Thompson still chattering, spraying a deadly arc of lead through the cluster of German soldiers closest to him. Men screamed and crumpled to the ground. Blood stained the white snow. Hot brass casings ejected into the frigid air. Then the magazine ran empty. 30 rounds were gone in a flash. This was the moment of truth. A practiced soldier can reload a Thompson in 2 seconds. In a gunfight, 2 seconds is an eternity. More than enough time for 90 men to kill one. Funk ripped the empty magazine out, slammed a fresh one in, racked the charging handle, and resumed firing. The entire action was a seamless blur, pure muscle memory. It was thousands of hours of repetitive training condensed into a single, fluid act of violence. At the same time, he was roaring at his men, "Pick up their weapons! Pick up their weapons!" The 4 guards, who had been on their knees, scrambled for the rifles dropped by the dead Germans. Moments ago, they were captives awaiting their fate. Now, they were back in the fight for their lives. The Germans were in total disarray. Their officer was dead, and the American sergeant who had been laughing was now a whirlwind of death. No one had planned for this. No one knew what to do. A few started to return fire, bullets cracking past Funk's head. One round struck the American soldier, who had been standing beside him, killing him instantly. Funk just kept moving, kept firing, kept killing. His guards now had weapons and were adding to the chaos. The Germans were caught in a brutal, unexpected crossfire. The whole bloody affair was over in 60 seconds. When the gunfire ceased, 21 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. 24 more were wounded. The rest, over 40 of them, had thrown down their weapons, their hands held high in surrender. The prisoners were prisoners once more. Leonard Funk stood alone in the middle of the carnage, smoke wafting from his Thompson, surrounded by the bodies. To his men, he'd later remark it was the most idiotic display he'd ever witnessed. After the chaos, the conclusion felt strangely muted. Company C took control of Holzheim, and the German prisoners who had survived were escorted to the rear, this time with a significantly stronger escort. When Funk filed his report to his CO, it was just business as usual. One more skirmish in a long war. But a story like that doesn't stay quiet for long. Word spread like wildfire first through the regiment, then the division, until the entire 82nd Airborne was buzzing about the sergeant who stared down 90 Germans, laughed, and cut down half of them with his Thompson. By the time the recommendation for the Medal of Honor landed on desks in Washington, it was a foregone conclusion. His actions at Holzheim were undeniable. The man was facing odds of 90-1, with an enemy's weapon pressed directly into his stomach. Yet, instead of giving up, he chose to fight. The official citation details the moment he was ordered to surrender by a German officer who shoved a machine pistol into his abdomen, although overwhelmingly outnumbered and facing almost certain death. First Sergeant Funk, pretending to comply with the order, began slowly to unsling his submachine gun from his shoulder, and then with lightning motion, brought the muzzle into line and riddled the German officer. He then pivoted on the remaining Germans, laying down fire while yelling for his fellow Americans to grab the enemy's arms. On September 5, 1945, at the White House, President Harry Truman draped the Medal of Honor over Leonard Funk's shoulders. "I would rather have this medal," the president remarked, "than be President of the United States." Now, let's tally the accolades Leonard Funk collected during the Second World War. There was the Medal of Honor for his actions at Holzheim and the Distinguished Service Cross for taking out anti-aircraft positions in Holland. He earned a Silver Star for guiding 18 men across 40 miles of hostile territory in Normandy. Add to that a Bronze Star for meritorious service, and not one, but 3 Purple Hearts. He was wounded on 3 separate occasions and returned to the fight each time. He also received international honors, the Croix de Guerre from France, Belgium's Order of Leopold, and the Military Order of William from the Netherlands, their nation's highest military honor. This made Leonard Funk the most decorated paratrooper of the entire Second World War, standing just 5 feet, 5 inches tall and weighing 140 pounds. The one-time shop assistant had transformed into a living legend. But when the war was over, Funk simply returned home. There would be no memoir, no national speaking tour, no leveraging his Medal of Honor for a career in public speaking or politics. He had no interest in capitalizing on his renown. Instead, he went back to Pennsylvania and began working for the Veterans Administration. He joined the ranks of the VA, the enormous government agency charged with the care of the nation's former servicemen. His new mission was helping his fellow veterans wrestle with bureaucracy, file their disability claims, and slice through the endless red tape for men who had sacrificed so much and now needed assistance, claiming the benefits they had earned. It was the same sort of administrative job he held before the war, quiet, without glory, but absolutely vital. For 27 years, Leonard Funk worked from a desk, dedicating his life to serving veterans. He steadily climbed the career ladder, eventually becoming the division chief for the Pittsburgh Regional Office. It was a life of decent pay, predictable hours, and a secure pension for retirement. And through it all, his wife, Gertrude, was right there by his side. The couple raised 2 daughters, making their home in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, a blue-collar neighborhood in a hard-working town, not far from his own childhood home. Somewhere in that house, his Medal of Honor was kept in a display case, along with the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and all those honors from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But he never spoke of them. If anyone ever brought up Holtzheim, the moment he laughed in the face of 90 Germans, he'd just dismiss it with a shrug. Did what was necessary. That was the only explanation he ever offered. On November 20th, 1992, in Braddock Hills, Pennsylvania, Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. passed away from cancer at the age of 76. His final resting place is Arlington National Cemetery. He lies in Section 35, grave 23734, taking his place among the honored dead from every conflict in American history. When he passed, he was the final living Medal of Honor recipient from the 82nd Airborne Division of World War II. A fitness center at Fort Bragg, since renamed Fort Liberty, carries his name. A stretch of highway in Pennsylvania is also named in his honor. In 2023, a post office in McKeesport was dedicated to his memory. Yet, despite these honors, the name Leonard Funk remains unknown to most Americans. They recognize names like Audie Murphy and Alvin York, legendary recipients of the medal, but they've never heard of the unassuming, short-statured paratrooper who faced down 90 enemy soldiers and personally eliminated 21 of them with his submachine gun. The life of Leonard Funk teaches us a crucial lesson. Combat doesn't reward sheer size or physical strength. It doesn't belong to the impulsive or even the completely fearless. Victory in war belongs to those who can maintain their clarity of thought when all around them is chaos. At Holtzheim, surrendering would have been the only logical choice for Leonard Funk. The numbers were staggering, 90 against 1. A weapon was jammed into his gut. His soldiers were already prisoners. Any sane man would have raised his hands. But Funk's mind wasn't on the odds. It was on Malmedy. It was on the 84 American GIs who were slaughtered in a field. He was thinking about the fate of prisoners in German hands. And most of all, he was thinking about his own men, the 4 guards, forced to their knees, and the rest of his soldiers spread throughout the village, who would be ambushed from the rear if this enemy unit got away. And so, he let out a laugh. Perhaps it was a calculated move, or maybe a reaction to the extreme stress, or maybe he was just struck by the sheer absurdity of his situation. In that moment of the German officer's confusion, while his enemies were thrown off kilter, Leonard Funk sprang into action. A mere 60 seconds later, he stood amidst a scene of carnage, alive against all odds. This brings to mind a famous remark, often connected to President Truman, regarding the Medal of Honor. "I would rather have this medal than be President of the United States." Those were the words he spoke directly to Leonard Funk on September 5th, 1945, in the White House Rose Garden. Just let that sink in. The most powerful man on the planet, who had just brought the Second World War to a close. The architect of the New World Order was looking at a 5'5" former shopkeeper from Pennsylvania and telling him, "I would rather be you," because President Truman understood a fundamental truth, one that becomes clear to anyone who reads a Medal of Honor. Citation: true bravery has nothing to do with physical stature, muscle, or even training. Courage is defined by the choice you make when a gun is pressed to your stomach and 90 men are determined to see you die. Disclaimer: this story is created solely for educational and informational purposes. It aims to provide relationship guidance and awareness, not to target or identify any individual. The events and characters depicted are entirely fictional, intended for entertainment and learning. Our content is advertiser-friendly and does not promote hate, offense, or harm in any form. The goal is to help viewers gain insights and make informed decisions based on life experiences.